So Kerry is the restoration ecologist at the Tampa Bay Estuary program, and probably many of you know her. She spent 18 years studying fish community dynamics and holds a BS in biological sciences from FSU and a master's in biology and coastal zone studies from the University of West Florida. And she likes to camp and kayak and hike with her husband and two sons when she's not on Zoom calls and saving the estuary. So Kerry's going to update us today on the TBEP Habitat Master Plan. So Kerry, I think if you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for the introduction, Maria. I appreciate that. Um, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Right. Um, so you gave a good introduction, but I put a little picture here in the side just to show, what I spent most of my career doing is basically catching, measuring, and playing with fish. So I've got a lot of experience in looking at habitat linkages with the animals that live in the ecosystems that we're talking about restoring. And today I'm going to talk about how the estuary program coordinates habitat restoration throughout the watershed and some potential linkages that we have between what you all are doing with the resiliency group and some of the objectives that are in the resiliency action plan. So there's a few places where I think I can outline some areas of collaboration. And some of these are based on our comprehensive conservation and management plan that all estuary programs have, and also through our Habitat Master Plan targets and goals. So there's a lot of ways that we can kind of work together towards the same goals. And then the second part of it is I'm going to update you on where we stand as far as restoration project progress within the Tampa Bay watershed, and our priority habitats for restoration in the coming year. So when Caleb reached out to me, he mentioned that this group is focused on Objective 5.1 of the Regional Resiliency Action Plan, which part of that is to support the Tampa Bay Habitat Master Plan goals. And we have pretty large goals of restoring up to 3,000 acres in a bunch of different priority habitats. So there's just an arrow with our Habitat Master Plan, and then also under the local action menu, you can see that it also talks about incorporating some of the things that you're doing here, and matching them up with what's in our CCMP. So I wanted to first kind of highlight our CCMP because we've actually got a new landing page and new ways to interact with it that are pretty cool. So we just redid our like basically how you access this plan. It used to be a searchable PDF, but now it's an interactive website. And when you go to that website right there, you'll come up with this map that looks really, really cool. It's got a bunch of little icons, and you can click on those individual icons to get to particular areas of the conservation and management plan. And these are all underneath our three main pillars or priorities throughout the estuary program, which are to have clean waters and sediments, to have thriving habitats and abundant wildlife, and also to have an informed and engaged and responsible community. So, we can come and talk to folks like you and communicate what we're trying to do. So if you were to click on this icon right here that has a mangrove with some oysters in it, it would bring you to this page. And this page actually has the actions that we want to do within this management plan. So this one is the one that applies to what I'm talking about, which is implementing the Habitat Master Plan. But you can also see that there's related actions on the side. So for example, looking at mitigation or hard bottom impacts. And then you can also filter through it and look at some of our water quality actions and some of our community actions as well. So I just wanted to put that out there for you all to, kind of explore at your own leisure and I know that there's a crosswalk that the Regional Planning Council has that matches up some of the goals that they have with the goals that we have as well. So before I get into actually talking about the Habitat Master Plan, I kind of wanted to set the stage for what we're up against. So this is an analysis that my colleague Marcus, who's our program scientist, did with some co-authors, basically looking at the last 30 years and how the habitat use has changed over time. And there's a lot of different habitats on this graph, but what I do want you to see is basically this large wide stripe that goes from restorable habitat to developed habitat. So a large amount of restorable habitat that we had in the 1990s is now developed. So we've got diminishing restoration opportunities over time, and anyone that's drove through the watershed knows that this is happening. So there's a real urgency to capitalize on the areas that are left, whether they're, conserved already, to restore them or to actually acquire new land so that we can restore them. So moving into that, that's kind of the stage where the Habitat Master Plan was updated in 2020. And we know that we're not going to get back to the historical extent of where we were at back in the 90s or further back than that. But what we can do is we can maximize the potential for restoration in the areas that are left. So we looked at all the native habitats in the watershed and looked at trends in habitat changes. And then we also looked at current and future stressors and incorporated that into the plan. And it focuses on these existing opportunities. And in practice, there's a 10-year time frame for targets that we want to get to for each habitat type, and then a 30-year time frame that we want to get to as far as goals. So those are all kind of laid out in the plan. And this depends on, whether they're already conserved, if they're potentially something we can acquire. And I want to point out these pink areas. These are the ones that are really close to the coast that, as the Resiliency Coalition, you'll be interested in. These are kind of the priority habitats we wanted to acquire or restore, because these are the ones that are in danger from climate effects, especially sea level rise. So we didn't want this just to be a standalone document. This was done in 2020. We wanted to be able to update it with time and be able to actually give progress reports to the community. Okay, where are we now? How close are we to the targets that we laid out? And can we get there in that time frame? So we used the Water Management District aerial mapping for subtidal habitats and intertidal and supertidal habitats. And these mapping cycles run every 2 years or every 3 to 4 years, depending on what they're looking at. And then in addition, so since those mapping cycles only go every couple of years, we want to get a finger on the pulse of what's actually happening annually. So we already, as an estuary program, have to report on habitat restoration projects that are happening within the watershed to the EPA, because they fund half of our work. So we've been doing that annual reporting since 2006, and we've been able to match that to the habitat types that we've identified as priorities. And this is voluntary, so all our partners, I send out an email and say, hey, okay, if you've finished any habitat restoration projects, please report them to us. It's only as good as the amount of participation we get from our watershed partners, but it's usually pretty good. So those are the two data sources that I'll be talking about. So this is a table that you can find on our website related to our Habitat Master Plan. And it basically shows you the different habitat types that we're interested in, what the current extent is as far as acreage or miles, and where we want to go in 2030, which is the 10-year horizon, and then where we want to get to in 2050, which is, the 30 years. So you can see there's a couple of checks here on the 2030 and even in the 2050 of where we've actually met some of those targets and goals, but we still have a long way to go. And I know that this table is a little hard to take in, so I'm going to zoom in on one particular habitat. So this is what it looks like for oysters. And this is just tracking restoration project progress over time. So when the Habitat Master Plan was done, they used the mapping cycle that ended in 2018. And at that point, there were 171 acres. Currently, what we're working off of is the 2022 mapping cycle, although the 2024 is almost ready to go. We just have to get the shape file. So, I was hoping it would be done for this meeting, but it's not yet. But right now we're at 230 acres. So we used the Water Management District mapping, but we also added in some new data that FWC was doing, mapping live oysters throughout the state. So between those two data sets, we got to 230 acres. So we actually did meet that 2030 target this round. So that's great. But for 2050, our goal is actually 471 acres. So that's a large lift, and we still have a long way to go. So we still need to, keep reporting on this progress and make sure our partners are continuing to do their good work. Another way that we can look at it, we put together basically a red light, green light table that shows us our progress towards the 2030 target. So that's like the 10-year time series. And the way that you read this, the habitats are up across the top. And for the red arrows, the target is not met for 2030. For the green arrows, it is. And then if it's pointing up, it looks like we will trend towards meeting that target in 2030, but if it's pointing down, it doesn't look like we're meeting it. So there's a couple of targets that we're looking really good for. So for example, mangrove forests mangrove forests are in the green and looking up. But unfortunately, salt marshes are in the red and they're looking down. And there's a little bit of interplay there between, increasing salt marshes and decreasing or increasing mangroves and decreasing salt marshes. But this gives us a way to tell our partners like, hey, we're in the green now, but it looks like it might be trending downwards. So keep up your restoration progress. So that's one way that we look at it. And this is still, again, based on the mapping. This is information from those annual reports that we get from partners. So in addition to the data that we get from 2006 on, we've also got information on habitat restoration projects going all the way back to 1971. So this is a map that shows the locations of all those habitat restoration projects over time, close to 1,000 over that time frame, and hundreds of thousands of acres restored, maintained, or protected, and almost 100 miles of habitat. So this is another way that we can say, okay, well, the mapping is saying that we're doing this, but you know what? We actually had these habitat restoration projects that happened last year that might not actually show up on the maps yet, but we're getting towards that, getting towards those targets. So another way that we can look at that, because we were able to match up the habitat types that we have laid out in the Habitat Master Plan with what we reported to EPA, we can actually look at the proportion of those habitats that are restored over time each year. So you'll see, first of all, the one good thing to notice is that we're getting more reports over time. So we're connecting with more partners. Maybe there's more restoration projects happening as well. I hope it's a combination of both. And you'll also notice that the majority of the projects are happening in uplands, which is really great because, those are the ones that are most commonly developed for, residential and other types of things. In the last year, we also had an uptick in a couple of different habitats like seagrasses and oysters. And you can see that a little bit in more detail if you look just at the last 3 years. So we've had a nice increase in the amount of projects that are reported. And this really just depends on when a project is finished. So we get that report when the project is finished. Again, you can see in 2024, we had over 80 projects. Most were uplands, but we had a lot of projects within oysters and seagrasses. So that's good as well. So we can take all of this information, the large scale kind of mapping information, the individual annual reporting, and what we've done is we've put together a 2-page document that's a report card to our partners. And all these links are in the presentation. I'm sure that, Caleb can share those afterwards. But basically, we put together the annual reporting, we put together the long-term kind of mapping results and the habitat report card with the red and green arrows. And between the two of those, we can say, okay, well, we've got a couple of priority habitats that we really want to focus on based on the trends that we see. This is something that's been vetted by our Habitat Restoration Consortium, and they find it useful. For 2024, the priority habitats that we had laid out for our group were seagrasses, salt marshes, and forested freshwater wetlands. And those are some of the ones that were either showing declining trends or just haven't met their targets yet. So those are ones that, in the back of their mind when they're doing restoration, if you can choose to do one of those, it'd be useful to do that. We also like to give props for, what's being done well. For example, the oysters and uplands. They're doing really great. They're meeting the targets, but we've got really aggressive goals for 2050, so we need to keep up that progress. And then finally, mangroves are doing fine for now, right? And that's a discussion that I think will be really relevant to this group. The mangroves are expanding now, and they're doing really well. Some of them are, kind of replacing some of the salt marshes, but with sea level rise, will that continue? Will we keep those habitats? We don't know. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that all of these opportunities are not in the same space, right? So Pinellas County doesn't have a lot of restoration opportunities. It's pretty well developed. There's quite a bit in Hillsborough County, Manatee County. So the restoration potential is different depending on where you're at. And it's also important to be strategic in the areas that you're restoring and acquiring to make sure that you have a nice connectivity aspect to it as well. The other thing that we're doing is not only are we looking at this, kind of classic way that we've looked at these restoration areas, we're also looking at new opportunities to increase the way that we're finding the restoration potential. So we recently finished a study that incorporated some satellite imagery from NOAA. It's called their CCAP data, the Coastal Change Analysis Program. So the standard water management district information, the minimum mapping unit is 1/2 acre to 5 acres, but the CCAP is 1 meter. So you can get really high resolution. And so our thought was we could get additional opportunity areas based on that. So our partners at FWC did a comparison there and found an additional over 11,000 acres that are potential restoration areas. The largest opportunity is in palustrine wooded areas, followed by open developed areas, kind of like parks or potentially golf courses, things like that. So we're always looking for new ways to get opportunities out there for our partners. So if you're interested in more of this, we've got a lot of resources on our website, and you can also join our Habitat Restoration Consortium, and this is where we talk about all these issues. The partners come in and talk about the restoration work they're doing. So that's the link there, and we've got a lot of information there. Previous meetings, you can look at recordings if there's anything that interests you, and that's where you can get a link to the Habitat Report Card and all the information that I've just talked about. In addition, we're trying to make it really easy for our partners to report these habitat restoration projects. So last year, we started an online data entry portal so that they can easily enter the restoration projects year round instead of just kind of collating them at the end of, we report on a fiscal year process. So, we ask for projects from September through October. So that's made it really easy for us on our ends to, kind of make sure that all the data are, the same, and we don't have to do as much cleaning of that. And then the next step of that is we've actually now archived all this restoration data on an open platform called K&B. So you can actually download this restoration data if you want and play with it yourself. So there's a link there as well. And we just updated this with the 2024 data, and it'll do the same once we have 2025 data in hand as well. So that's kind of the Tampa Bay Estuary program part of, the Habitat Master Plan, but there's also a couple of other aspects of the Regional Resilience Action Plan that relate to some of the projects that we're doing. So, for example, in this Objective 5.2, it talks about improving water quality and reevaluating the assimilative capacity of Tampa Bay. So we've actually got a project ongoing called the Old Tampa Bay Assimilative Capacity Assessment, where a contractor is actually looking into ways that we can assess how nutrient loading is going into Old Tampa Bay, because that's one of the areas we have problems with water quality. Um, and when they were doing this project, they actually ended up having a habitat restoration uh, recommendation for us. So one of their recommendations is when they were modeling all this information, bringing in chlorophyll data, nutrient data, all sorts of water quality data for Old Tampa Bay, they also brought in, okay, well, what if we added an additional 175 acres of oysters into the system? What would that do to water quality, and how would that help us with nutrient loading? And what they found was, so that blue line is with oysters. So you can see that the chlorophyll A concentration, which is kind of a proxy for, phytoplankton blooms and things, was lower in almost all years until the end. So there's actually some pretty good information that we brought to the Habitat Restoration Consortium and said, hey, we usually don't look at this regionally when we're talking about restoration. It's usually a Bay-wide thing. But if we concentrate on restoring 175 acres just in Old Tampa Bay, we could actually help with water quality as well. So that's one example of, how the habitat restoration is linking up with some of these actions in the RAP. And then there's also another project that we have going that's almost contracted, which has to do with stormwater. So under Objective 6.2, it says prioritize green infrastructure projects. So this multi-jurisdictional project that we're funding as part of a NOAA Restore grant is actually to do a surface water assessment of Old Tampa Bay, which again is the bay segment that's been having issues and has been having seagrass loss consistently. And within that, we're going to prioritize an inventory of up to 12 stormwater projects that'll help with nutrient loading. And we want to make sure that they're focused on more natural infrastructure type projects. And then, we're going to get stakeholder field feedback, and we're going to rank those projects. And the top couple are actually going to get designed and permitted. And if the pot of money still exists, we're going to actually get another 8 million. So this is a $1.5 million project. And if the money still exists, we'll get another $8 million to actually implement one or two of these projects. So we're working on that realm as well. So these are all really good plans. But the challenge is, we can do these, but there's also the challenge of incorporating resiliency and sea level rise and all these different climate stressors into all these projects that we're doing. So this is an example of, coastal squeeze. So this is a website that we have that does some modeling that looks at, the accretion of sediments and sea level rise and how the habitats will change. So this is kind of the worst case scenario. If we have low accretion of sediments and really high sea level rise, if you notice the change in the two different green colors, the light green is mangroves, the dark green is seagrasses. Here we are in 2020, but if you go to 2100, you can see that the mangroves are disappearing and the seagrasses are moving up. And of course, that's completely dependent on water quality and a whole bunch of other factors. So we can have these targets and goals, but if the system changes a lot, then how do we meet them? So one of the things that's a problem is if habitat can migrate like that if there's softly developed lands, right? But if there's not and they run into a seawall, then the habitat is going to stop. So those are things that we kind of have to take into account. And that leads me to the last project that we're collaborating with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, which is the Tampa Bay Coastal Master Plan. And this plan is going to expand some of the work that we've already done within the Tampa Bay watershed to the entire service area of the Regional Planning Council to look at flood risks and propose local adaptation projects. And in our case, we're going to be identifying some vulnerable coastal habitats and identify restoration projects in areas that are currently not developed. So expanding this work to a larger spatial area and also develop some plans and potential projects. Um, So just to kind of sum up, three main takeaways that I hope you take from this is, first of all, it's really urgent that we preserve and restore these areas based on the pace of development. It's really important to collaborate to restore priority habitats across agencies and, nonprofits and everybody that's in that space. And then finally, and this is the point that I think the regional, the that your group could potentially help us on is, the climate stressors and development are making it more difficult to reach these restoration goals. So can this committee or, the Regional Resiliency Action Plan fill the last kind of spot here? And what are the explicit ways that the RRAP could ensure that we can meet those HMP goals in the face of climate stressors? So, thinking about things like, how are the habitat goals threatened by various climate hazards? And how do we identify priorities and tactics to make achieving those goals more likely? So, there's a couple ways that that could be done, potentially having some voluntary blue-green carbon markets to restore priority habitats, looking at living shorelines to help restore oysters and salt marshes, maybe even looking at rolling easements to protect mangroves when that coastal squeeze kind of comes into effect. So, the other thing to think about is tidal creeks. They're really extremely vulnerable to projects that might not be good for them. So for flood control or, channelization and things like that. So how do we keep our tidal creeks healthy as well? So that's kind of what I'm posing to you, and super easy to solve, right? So I'll take any questions, and thanks for having me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kerry. That was really great. And it's also inspiring to hear that there's some things to hear, like oyster restoration is, still got a lot to go, and also where we need to work on, right? I think you did a great job summarizing complex data and then distilling it down for us. So there's several questions in the chat. Um, let's see if I can scroll. I don't know if you can see them. So one was from Taylor, who said, are there partnerships with local economic development and tourism related organizations to communicate and invest in the importance of this great work? The impact of poor water quality, failing habitats, et cetera, can impact our economy in significant ways.
Um, so could you repeat the question? That was
Yeah,
the
let me
first part,
see.
right?
Are there partnerships with local economic development and tourism related organizations? So the basic thing is so much of our economy is driven by ecotourism or fishing and stuff like that. And where are those partnerships? Does Tampa Bay Estuary Program? Taylor might want to jump in here and say this. Is Tampa Bay Estuary Partnership doing those partnerships, or other people that are saying restoration is important because it ties in directly to an important and economic drivers in our community?
Yeah, so I'll chime in. Like visit Tampa Bay, visit St. Pete Clearwater. All these big economic development sort of organizations that we have that are trying to attract, businesses and people to come here. Are they plugged into all of this work, and are they investing in this work?
I won't say that I've seen those specific organizations, at any of our meetings or anything, but I do know that we make a really concerted effort to get this information out there. Everything that I presented is front and center on our website. We try and, distill the science as best as we can. I mean, that's kind of our goal, is to synthesize complex scientific information and make sure that it's relatable. And we went through several iterations with that habitat report card to make it so that, people could actually understand it. So we definitely do presentations at community groups. We get a lot of requests, and we've got a whole communications team that does, give a day for the Bay projects where people can get involved and actually get their hands dirty and planting mangroves and or whatever else projects are going on. So, I mean, we're definitely open to that. And, the more the merrier as far as getting involved in this work and making sure that it's communicated.
Yeah, it sounds like the answer to my question is no from
Yeah.
your perspective.
Yeah.
And let's fix that. And I will reach out to you directly to get to work. We've got some stuff we're working on that might help with that. So
Yeah, that's great.
Great.
That's good.
Thank you so much. So, Kerry, the next one is Zach. I don't know if you want to ask your question, but I don't know if you know about stewards of our urban lakes, or SOUL.
We do.
So Zach asked, where does ecological restoration of urban lakes fit into this restoration plan?
So we actually fund a lot of the work that that group does. So we have a couple of different grant programs that we support community projects. So one is more focused towards restoration practitioners and scientists in the uh, ecological community, and that's our Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund. So that's for larger projects. But we also have our mini grant projects, which are completely funded by the tarp and tag, the license plate that goes towards the Tampa Bay Estuary program. And a lot of those are, citizen science groups, educational groups, schools, businesses. Any one of those types of organizations can apply for those grants, and if they're working towards doing restoration, not only will we fund those, but then those groups can actually report back to us, and we'll put it in our database as a project that we report on each year. So the op the grant cycle for the mini grants is actually opening in May. So if anybody knows of anyone that's interested in that, we'll have some informational webinars about that coming up.
Good, thank you. We've got a couple more, and Caleb, if you can just help me keep on time, and then we'll take calls from questions from the audience. So Jared asks about, regarding the loss of habitat to develop land, is there any regional initiative to support the backyard wildlife refuge concept that are promoted in FWC's planning a refuge for wildlife? So this is sort of, how can we who have land and have backyards contribute to restoration, or at least watershed stability and decreasing nutrient loading? I think that's what he's asking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of things that you can do to contribute to this. So, one of the main things that impedes water quality in the bay is nutrient loading. So, knowing when it's appropriate to fertilize your lawn, or maybe not fertilize it at all, that's one thing that an individual homeowner can do. I know that my front yard is just a meadow of weeds. But that also can help with pollinators as well. If you have a more natural landscape using native plants, that's another thing that you can do. There's a lot of work that the Florida Wildlife Corridor does along that realm, where if you've got several neighborhoods that are kind of connected, and have those types of plants in their yards, then those pollinators have a place to kind of land and move on and have their own kind of mini corridor within urban environments. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Jared. And thank you, everybody, for the questions. I think we've got most of them. And I think we have time for one more question. And then, Kerry, I hope you can stay on, because This was a deliberate pairing of speakers. So the next speaker is going to talk about the approach of bioregionalism, and we'll have a lot more time for discussion of, the marriage of these two concepts, because basically that's what the estuary program is looking at. How we restore an estuary way in the coastal uplands. It begins there, right? So I don't know. Caleb, do we have time for one more question, or should we go on transition?
Yeah, one more question, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of, build on what you said, a lot of folks don't realize that we do fund projects all the way up into the watershed. So, every drop of water that's within that large watershed boundary is something that we care about. So, we fund restoration, all the way up in Polk County, or like over towards Lakeland and up north into Pasco County. So.
Yeah. Good. I got one more question. I just want to comment that I used to work in the Chesapeake Bay region, and we just used to walk around saying everything we do on the land affects the water. But trying to help people in Pennsylvania understand they were impacting the Chesapeake Bay watershed, oftentimes there was that disconnect. So Indy had a question that I think Liz Terra's mostly answered, which was, who does the labor for building the oyster habitats? How is their labor regenerative, both physically, financially, emotionally, et cetera? So I think Liz Terra chimed in on that, but I don't know if you want to weigh in on that as well. Thank you, Kerry.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities. There's quite a few, nonprofit groups that are doing oyster restoration now, and they have a lot of opportunities for folks to actually get their hands dirty and help in the different methods that they're using. VOGS is one. I saw that in the chat. One of our partners, Oyster River Ecology, has been doing what's called oyster rag pots, which are kind of fun to build. We've worked with our partners. One was a Bay Mini grant with Invincible Summer Enterprises in partnership with Pinellas County, where they were doing oyster volcanoes, which is pretty fun. Basically just, wrapping, cement covered fabric around a mold. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to get involved, but then there's also like the engineering side where they're doing like large scale stuff with, putting mulch out and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kerry. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I learned so much. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caleb, who's going to introduce our next speaker, Joe Brewer.
Thank you so much, Kerry, and for the work, and then for bringing it and framing it to the discussion and where we are. And like she mentioned in her presentation, we have one of our goals of this, well, the whole regional action plan, but then this committee that's working on it is how are we doing better at supporting that. So this was a really big, important step of starting to understand it some. I know I was motivated and inspired by a lot of what's already taking place, and really think it's important work. Have the distinct pleasure of introducing Joe Brewer, and I have like a formal bio I'll read in a second. But my journey with this group and in kind of looking at things at the regional level has really corresponded to a journey that I've had through the Design School for Regenerating Earth, of which Joe is a co-founder. For the last year, I've had the luxury of learning under him and others that are in the design school about this idea of bioregionalism, and with certainly when you're looking at the things that the estuary program is doing at the regional level and seeing that there's so much crossover there, but with the Regional Planning Council as well, how do we come together and look at this and realize that resiliency is built regionally, right? And I think there's a lot of knowledge of that. And I'm really excited to introduce some of these ideas through Joe today. So Joe Brewer is the founder of Earth Regenerators, a co-founder of the Design School for Regenerating Earth, co-founder of Fundación Barichara Regenerativa, pardon my Spanish, and a steward for Bioregional Earth. He is a regenerative designer who works on large-scale system change by bringing deep knowledge and experience from complexity, cultural evolution, the cognitive sciences, and Earth systems. Throughout the last 5 years, Joe has helped catalyze a bioregional regeneration effort in the northern Andes of Colombia. This includes a focus on ecosystem restoration, regenerative education, alternative approaches to flow funding and regenerative finance, and collaboration at landscape scales. You can learn more about his work by reading his book, The Design Pathways for Regenerating Earth, or by checking out the Design School for Regenerating Earth. Really excited to introduce Joe Brewer.
Well, thank you, Caleb, but even more, Kerry, thank you for those 18 years of playing with fish. and everything you're doing. It's pretty amazing. So basically what bioregionalism is what Kerry does. And we'll see why that is in a moment. But this way of taking a holistic approach that follows principles such as you don't divide a watershed because nature doesn't. And so if you create a jurisdiction that divides watersheds, you're probably doing something that's not going to work very well. There are other ideas like this, where basically when we design from, to sort of be crude, to design based on reality and what is real actually works better. And it turns out a lot of our boundaries for jurisdiction and for organizing and for our work are on what are rather foolish human political constructs or human social constructs, rather than ecological or geologic realities. And so what we're going to talk about today is basically what Caleb asked me to do is to give an introduction, very simple, like, you know, the Cliff Notes version of what is bioregionalism, and then explore how it relates to the resilience work taking place in the Tampa Bay. And the way that I've decided to do this in a brief way is to do a compare and contrast with two other large-scale landscape systems, one of which has taken a bioregional approach that is similar in scale and complexity to Tampa Bay, and another one that has not. And so we'll have a really brief review of the Gulf of Maine, which has done some really nice bioregional work, and the Sea of Cortez, which is a total disaster. And to see why a bioregional way of thinking shows us some of the differences between those two contexts. And I would say what Kerry has just shown us is that a lot of what I'm about to talk about has already been happening for a long time in the Tampa Bay. But by making it more explicit, more overt, and a more shared understanding, I think can really answer the kinds of questions that Taylor was asking, where different actors or potential allies in the region would see themselves as aligned and would learn to find each other. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. And so I decided to title my talk today, Seeing the Tampa Bay with Bioregional Eyes, because more than anything else, this is a way of imagining and showing up in the world, which has tremendous consequences. But if we can't see the world based on its ecological reality, then we can't interact with that reality in a coherent way. And so what I want to do is very briefly explore how bioregionalism brings us into contact with our ecological existence. So what is a bioregion? I'm going to start by sharing this historical map created by John Wesley Powell in the 1870s, back when he was mapping out the landscapes of at the time, the Louisiana Purchase, bringing land into the United States. And he suggested that the Western states should probably have their boundaries drawn around watersheds. And this is a map that he created. He proposed it to the US Congress, and as you can see, they rejected it. Instead, you look at states like Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico as square objects with straight lines that completely ignore the ecological reality of watersheds. So John Wesley Powell was practicing bioregional thinking, because what a bioregion is, in its essence, is a whole systems view of landscapes where you take the life context of the place as your basis. So you create a geographic understanding of a place that is grounded in the way that living systems function. So that should be obvious that it would be related to watersheds. So this way of thinking is basically to look at reality by starting with the hard boundaries of geology for land morphology. Where are your tectonic plates? Where are your mountain ranges? Where are your drainage basins for water? How does this create the shape of the land and the types of soils and rocks that are there? And how is it organized by the flow of water into watersheds, into regional climate, and into types of ecosystems? When you start with that, you can layer in boundaries that are a little bit more fuzzy, that move around. Things like weather systems and ecosystems. Is it forest? Is it salt marshes and mangroves? What kind of ecology is possible in the kind of geology that you're dealing with? And when you layer on top of that cultural history and cultural identity, you know, we are the people of the Pacific Northwest. We are the people of the Great Lakes. This way of having a cultural identity connected with the way that people live and the way that people historically have lived. When you put all of this together, you start to create a bioregional understanding. So what John Wesley Powell was trying to do by suggesting that the boundaries of US states should be watersheds is he was trying to create an ecological and geologic way of creating political boundaries. And when you take that way of thinking, you'll start to see that other patterns become important too. Things like subsistence living for indigenous people, or extended trade networks and cultural exchanges that give rise to language families across a region, or ways of constructing houses, or ways of gathering food, these kinds of ways of knowing how to live in your place. These are bioregional ways of thinking. So bioregionalism is one of those really old ideas going back to the very beginning of humanity, and in some ways back to the origins of life on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, but that was also renewed and revived in the last 50 years. So I want to give a very brief history of bioregionalism as it relates to what we're talking about today. So I'm going to go back to around 1900. Around 100 years ago, there was the beginning of work like this work by Patrick Geddes to start to explore urban and regional planning in a coherent way, where the way of planning a city as it's related to the mouth of a watershed, or doing regional planning around transport or around things like public health, that this, while it had an earlier history, about 100 years ago, it really became to a way of robustly organizing as a professional realm of practice. It's something you could study at a university. It's something that you could bring in as an administrative framework to do urban or regional planning. Now, this happened before what happened in the 1960s, where those of us who are old enough to know the 1960s was a really big time of radical change. But one of the things that occurred was the back to the land movement. People who were leaving cities to go and engage in permaculture farming or in other activities in their landscapes. And while this was a very prevalent US-based movement, there was a corresponding movement in other parts of the world. And what gave rise, what emerged after this was the global modern environmental movement, with people like Rachel Carson writing the book Silent Spring, with the invention of the very first operational satellite, which was deployed in 1971, with the blue marble, the first time of seeing the entire Earth from space, giving rise to planetary consciousness. This global environmental movement led to, in the early 1970s, the United Nations creating the first international frameworks for environmental law. Now, unfortunately, those frameworks treated humans as separate from the rest of nature. So there were a group of deeper environmental thinkers who rebelled against that and said, you can't address the environment as if humans aren't part of it. And they gave birth to the bioregional movement in the late 1970s into the early 80s. An example in the place that I grew up in, the Ozarks, which is a plateau region that includes Missouri and Arkansas, where people said, let's start organizing a bioregional Congress. And the Ozarks Bioregional Congress, the first one took place in 1980. People in Appalachia said, our cultural identity as Appalachians matters more to us than other things that are happening globally. Let's learn how to organize back to the land and an environmental awareness at the Appalachian scale. In the 1970s, there was a science fiction book called Ecotopia that gave rise to the Cascadia bioregional movement, with other factors as well, which is the bioregional name for the Pacific Northwest. So this bioregional movement really took off about 50 years ago. And what it led to was a series of bioregional congresses. Actually, the 45th Ozarks Bioregional Congress took place in October of last year and is still happening. Whereas the Cascadia Bioregional Congress, the first one was in 1986, and they had their last one, I think, sometime around 2012. And the Turtle Island, or North American version of bioregional congresses, took place between the early 90s to around 2010 or so. And so during this period, there was this very massive movement of bioregional congresses that gave rise to green cities and urban sustainability. The first urban sustainability work was the Green Cities program of San Francisco, which was started in 1986 by the Planet Drum Foundation, with the work of Peter Berg, a very important bioregional movement, and then Sustainable Seattle in 1991, creating the first urban sustainability indicators, which were part of the Cascadia bioregional movement. So urban sustainability really grew out of this bioregional understanding before it spread way beyond the bioregional movement. And of course, regional planning existed before this time, but anyone who's been involved in regional planning in the last 50 years will know that it has accelerated and matured incredibly like the example of the Tampa Bay Resilience Commission. This kind of regional planning around transport systems, around food sheds and fiber sheds, around watershed management, around coastal estuaries, around conservation management, all of this was maturing between the 1970s and the present, and it was often connected with the bioregional movement. Although that's not very well known today, because the bioregional movement went quiet and a lot of these things kept going without remembering their bioregional roots. So of course, there was also, starting in the mid-1970s, the Land Back, Land Defenders, Indigenous rights movements, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights in 1977, which was profoundly connected to the bioregional movement in places like Cascadia or in Nova Scotia or in New England. And then there was the Transition Network of around 2007, 2010, which was a post-carbon, peak oil kind of a movement around community resilience, which spread all over the world. And a lot more. I mean, I'm just summarizing here. But the bioregional movement has touched many, many different spaces throughout the last 50 years. And then more recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, the regenerative movement has really taken hold. And the idea of regenerating the entire Earth has emerged as something we need to do. And this is based on a deep understanding of Earth system sciences, a profound richness of learnings about cultural evolution or applied and guided social change. And a new wave of bioregionalism has taken hold in the last 5 years. And my partner, Penny Heipel, and I have been big instigators of it. A lot of my friends in the bioregional movement call me a Johnny Appleseed of bioregionalism, because I travel around and plant seeds of bioregional thinking, like we're doing right now in this presentation. And this has been happening all over the world, but we've been playing our part in North, Central, and South America, while we have friends who are doing it in Oceania, Southeast Asia, in Africa, in different parts of Australia, in Europe. And so this is a planetary movement, even more so than it was in its first wave. But so basically this way of thinking is the emergence of whole systems approaches to regional planning and integrated landscape management, where you're organized with deep understandings of the living systems or regenerative processes as it's connected to planetary change. And we saw Kerry earlier talking about regional planning in the Tampa Bay and its larger watershed systems, but also climate change and sea level rise and other factors that are of a planetary nature that have regional impacts that require us to adapt as well as to mitigate and to try to restore these Earth system processes through bioregional frameworks. But there's also a much longer history of bioregionalism that goes back about 6 million years, because 6 million years, our ancestors parted ways with other great apes. So humans are most closely related genetically to chimpanzees, behaviorally most closely to bonobos. There are these great apes, and then they gave rise to the early hominids around 3 million years ago. And then something like 400,000 years ago, our species emerged, Homo sapiens. But here's the thing. During this entire 6 million year period of time, our ancestors lived bioregionally. They had sustainable patterns of social and ecological organization that lived within local landscapes or regional scale exchange networks of semi-nomadic behavior, horticultural behaviors, and other things. Which is to say, humans have been bioregional for most of our history until around 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, with the beginning of the Holocene, with the Neolithic revolution of agriculture and the rise of the first centralized city-states and civilizations, which gave rise to collapse of biosphere integrity in the last couple thousand years, and especially the last 100 years. There I'm talking about the mass extinction event that's taking place right now. There have been an ecological overshoot at a planetary scale since December 25th, 1971, according to the Global Footprint Network. So we are actually beyond the Earth's capacities to regenerate itself on a year-to-year basis. And the transgression of 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries as identified by the Stockholm Resilience Center. What this graphic is meant to convey is that to be sustainable is to be bioregional. And once humans stopped organizing bioregionally, we went very, very far from sustainable. So if we want to get back to sustainable, we have to reorganize ourselves in harmony with our whole life contexts, which is to organize ourselves up to the scale of bioregions. So how does that work? That's a really big ask. Well, what I want to do is offer a tale of two marine ecosystems. This is a really brief survey. There's a lot of details I'm going to leave out. But what I want to say is this: what can Tampa Bay learn from what has happened in the Gulf of Maine and the Sea of Cortez? Because one of these places adopted a bioregional approach to resilience planning as it went through a process of systemic collapse, which means they had to construct resilience through the collapse of an ecosystem and a regional economy. But the other place did not take a bioregional approach, and you can really see the difference today. So let's start with the Gulf of Maine. Here it is. This is change in ocean temperature around the world, and I want you to notice that the most rapid warming of the world's ocean anywhere on Earth is in the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of Maine has warmed by something like 8 to 10 degrees Celsius in the last 25 years. No other ocean body of water on the planet has warmed this quickly. So what the heck is going on? Well, it looks like this. Here's the Gulf of Maine. And if you looked up to your right outside of this map, you would see Greenland. So basically, Greenland has been melting. It's been dumping fresh water into the North Atlantic. And there is an ocean current from the Arctic that drops down between Nova Scotia and Greenland, bringing cold water into the North Atlantic. But that fresh water coming off of Greenland has actually come down to the south, pushed off to the west, and blocked that Arctic current from arriving, which means the Gulf of Maine no longer receives water from the Arctic Ocean. And of course, the Gulf Stream and the lower Atlantic waters closer to where you live in Tampa, those lower Gulf waters are warming, which means you lose the cold water from the north and you gain even more warm water from the south that is warmer than it used to be. And the Gulf of Maine is a shallow body of water. And since more water enters from the south that's much warmer, it's at a catastrophic increase in warming for the scale of the Gulf as a whole. This has had catastrophic effects on the fishing industry. So just two examples. This is from the Physical Sciences Laboratory in 2015. Warming water is a major factor in Gulf of Maine in the collapse of the cod industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry annually. And then in 2021, NOAA Fisheries saying the northern shrimp population collapse linked to warming ocean temperatures and squid predation, which is to say that the ecosystems are rapidly changing with this warming environment. So this is a catastrophic resilience challenge of a major regional ecological system with a huge economic consequence. So what did the people of the Gulf of Maine do? This is primarily organized by people like Glenn Page at Cobalt, which is the Collaborative for Bioregional Action, Learning, and Transformation for the Gulf of Maine. And what they've been doing is this. They've been taking a holistic approach to culture, ecology, and economy at the scale of the Gulf of Maine and all of the major watersheds on shore, on land, that drain into the Gulf of Maine. They convene multi-stakeholder groups from fishing industry, First Nations, because there are 5 indigenous groups who live in this region, academic and research communities, as well as local municipalities. And they convene these multi-stakeholder groups around the bioregional framework of the Gulf of Maine and its major watersheds. They explore alternative pathways into the future through what they call bioregional learning journeys, which they've been convening since around 2018. And they support and promote ecosystem restoration and economic development as an integrated framework at land system scale. Now, is it all working? No. But are they making progress? Absolutely. They stabilized their fisheries population and restored the fishing practices through the collaboration of conservation, restoration, and fisheries management, while working with First Nations people on the reservation land, as well as all of these other stakeholder groups. So their future has hope. It has possibility because the crisis prompted them to create these multi-stakeholder bioregional frameworks of collaboration. But if you look at the Gulf of California or the Sea of Cortez, it's a very different picture. Here is where the Colorado River no longer arrives to the Sea of Cortez, and actually the most biodiverse and biomass-rich estuary delta on the planet has basically died. Because in 1967, they closed the gates on Lake Powell on the Glen Canyon Dam. And since that time, water has only reached the ocean from the Colorado River once when they did an experimental test of flood management about 10 years ago. So basically, in 1967, they shut off the water that gets to the Sea of Cortez, and they killed an entire estuary and turned it into a desert overnight. Now, why did they do that? This is a textbook example for how to mismanage a major hydrological system. It's because this is the Colorado River. The Colorado River is your best example of water conflict of anywhere on Earth. So this is a problem that's riddled with conflicts because once you get to the Mississippi River and go west, the framework of water management is called the right of prior appropriation, which means whoever has an older water right gets cut off later when there's water scarcity, causing competition and infighting over water use, which means states have water rights, landowners have water rights, the US and Mexico have different water rights, and so the Colorado River fights over water rights between the different US states and Mexico. There's no unifying vision for the Colorado Basin or the Sea of Cortez that's to be found anywhere in this water management framework. And so that means there's nothing but a desolate future. So this is a disaster that is 100% human-made, and it absolutely requires a bioregional approach to ever be addressed, but there's no bioregional framework in place. So about a year and a half ago, my partner Penny Heipel and I traveled from the headwaters of the Colorado River and Rocky Mountain National Park all the way to the Sea of Cortez in Mexicali, Mexico, traveling to communities where we were invited to give talks where we asked the question, what would it take to regenerate the Colorado Basin? And everyone was shocked by the audacity of this question because they're so frustrated and burned out by all of the infighting about water. No one is thinking about regenerating the Colorado River until we showed up. But of course, we don't even live in the Colorado Basin. We live in Colombia in South America. So we came passing through encouraging people to organize themselves, which some of this is actually starting to happen. So the thing for us to learn here is that a bioregional framework creates a dreaming space to identify shared identity around a geographic range that makes sense. So how might we imagine the Tampa Bay through a bioregional lens? And your answer is Kerry's presentation and other frameworks like it. So you need to explore the rich geologic and ecological history of this unique place. The Tampa Bay is a very, very special place. It is not the Gulf of Maine. It is not the Sea of Cortez. It's unique in its geologic and ecological history. You need to create whole systems understandings for what is happening here to be able to see how the ecosystem restoration work is related to ecological or economic development, how it's related to education in public schools, how it's related to tourism, how it's related to the identity of the region for the people living here. Then you need to integrate the cultural history with the current social realities, which of course has boundaries around social demographics, racial issues, wealth inequality, the displacement of people, and on and on and on. All of those things fit within the framework. How do we manage our home at the bioregional scale? And then you can envision regenerative futures based on this understanding, where humans come into harmony with the living systems of their place, which can only work if you work up to the scale of the living systems, which will turn out to be the bioregional scale. So that's what I wanted to share with you, was this vision and this way of thinking, and to help you see how it works in different contexts. And what we found in practice is the bioregion is the smallest scale for regenerative design to actually work. And that's because the water and the landscape system and the ecosystems all self-organize that way already. It's the humans who fragmented and divided it with our jurisdictions. And so we'll end up working against ourselves at the systemic scale if we don't organize in this way. So I'd love to open up for discussion and questions. And I'd love to weave it with what Kerry's doing because it's so related. and to help us learn how to see this way of collaborating with other bioregions in different parts of the world who might be further along than you, or you might be further along than them. Like I'm already thinking, Kerry, that you would love to talk with the conservation authorities in Southern Ontario, who have already mapped large-scale ecosystem restoration work. They've identified 20,000 ecosystem restoration projects across Southern Ontario, and the conservation authorities are organized as watersheds. So I think these kinds of collaborations could make a lot of sense to just learn from and to validate each other. Say, look, what they're doing is what we're doing, and it's working, and so on. All right, I'll shut up now. I'd love to open it up for questions and conversation. And Caleb, thank you. Kara, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today.
Thank you very much, Joe. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so anybody who has a question, you can jump on, or if we get a queue, raise a hand, and we can just have a little discussion here about, I think both of them are so interrelated. I don't know if we separate the two presentations, but we can continue this discussion for a little while longer if there are thoughts.
Or just a moment for reflection. Kerry, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, so, with the way you're talking about bioregionalism, that really fits in with like watershed level, coordination of restoration. Some of the things that we've been noticing recently, I kind of mentioned that, the opportunities are not, they're spatially restricted into particular areas. And, in some cases, we're moving towards, for example, focusing in on Old Tampa Bay as, kind of a problem area within that watershed. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts, on, it is bioregional, but also we're kind of subsetting it a little bit based on what we can actually do and where the problems are.
I'll give a very small example around Victoria, British Columbia, where there's a small peninsula called the Saanich Peninsula, and there are 5 municipalities that have borderline jurisdictions with each other on the peninsula. And basically what was happening was there was a group working on water quality, and there was another group working on transportation, especially the buses, and how the public buses had to deal with point source contamination at the bus stops. And there was one guy who was a data manager, a GIS mapping guy, who just said, could I just talk to the other GIS people at the other 4 municipalities? I'd like to share my data with you because I'm upstream from you. And then they created a data sharing framework for the Saanich Peninsula. Because the Saanich Peninsula is a real geologic and ecological system, it is a bioregional framework, even though it's just a little bitty piece of the Vancouver Island, just a little piece of the Salish Sea. So it's a bioregional framework because it's a whole systems understanding that's organized around ecological reality. And of course, they recognize they're part of bigger systems. And so it's really you take a holistic framework for how you do data sharing in this case that actually led to policy frameworks between those municipalities, because obviously one of them could save money by bonding to another one, some kind of a bonding structure or some other policy instrument where they wouldn't even have to invest because someone else would do it because it was already in the other person's plan. And these sorts of things, they didn't even know about it till they shared data. So I would say that bioregional frameworks are fractal, which means you can take a small scale way of organizing, but it patterns with the same logic to the larger scale and reverse. You can take a large scale way of saying like the Tampa Bay is this, but Old Tampa Bay is this, but we want a prototype in this place for something we should replicate across the larger system. And that way of thinking is still bioregional. So absolutely, you can do it that way. I see Tara's got her hand up. Tara, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Sorry, I was actually here late, so I missed the first presentation, but hopped on just in time to see you. I'm from Tampa Bay, 4th generation, and something that I witness often that I feel like there needs to be a solution for, but it's kind of that overwhelming, how to start. I think the bioregionalism innately, like the language behind it feels so intrinsic and it's just a huge resounding yes, but then actually applying it feels a bit overwhelming. So a current problem that we have consistently is, and literally it's embarrassing to say, but we have regular sewage dumps just happening multiple times a year, and it's always oh, oops, can't believe it happened. And I will say I kind of have this feeling of, okay, who's going to step up? There's these groups like Tampa Bay Watch, Tampa Bay Estuary Program. There's the Water Warrior Alliance, and so on and so on. But like, how can we as a region, us as people who enjoy, our backyard and our bay, step up to create some solutions for this, but from a bioregional perspective? I'm not sure if you have any ideas for us.
I do, and I suspect Kerry probably will too. I would say at the core of bioregionalism is coming home, remembering the earth is our home, but also for you, Tampa Bay is your home. And so there's this feeling of the sacred. There's this feeling of when you enter the home of your mother, you treat it with respect and, that sort of thing. And there's this feeling of belonging. And that feeling of belonging is the basis of bioregionalism, which is why it's so strongly connected with indigenous movements. Indigenous people never lost this, whereas settler cultures often, that's why we're settler cultures. We were displaced. And so the belonging part, the falling in love with place, which is why so much of this, I think, can be done with youth and children education and outreach, with direct experience, with recreation, and just etc. How do you fall in love with your place? How does anyone fall in love with your place? Tampa Bay seems like a pretty easy place to fall in love with. And so the falling in love brings with it responsibility if people feel like they're in that relationship. So that's a really deep part of bioregionalism that moves toward the sort of eco-spiritual, or the deeper sense of, oh, my identity is connected to the life of this place. That's the sort of eco-spiritual way of saying it. Whereas the mundane way of saying, I belong here and we take care of our place. But I think that's like the core of it. And then there are lots of ways to express it. I'm guessing, Kerry, you might have something to say on that one too.
Yeah, I think I just want to give you a little ray of positivity, Tara, on that front, because we recently, after the storms, our program scientists actually took all the DEP data from the required reporting for sewer overflows, and basically compiled that information. There's data from 2017 through the present, and that reporting was put in place after like 2015, 2016, when there was some serious spills in the St. Pete area after I think it was Hermine. And what we found is, there are these things that happen on a yearly basis, but the larger impacts happen after these storm events, where there's just this overflow of storm surge and things like that. There was definitely a large impact after Helene and Milton went through this past year. But if you compare it to a baseline of what happened in 2015 and 2016, it was about half. And that was not as large of a storm season that we went through right now. So there has been progress from that time frame to now of improved management of wastewater and improvements to wastewater treatment plants. I'm not saying that it's cured or anything like that, but I just wanted to give kind of a ray of light on that, where that instance, spurred some movement, and that is something that's in our plan to help fund those type of projects, as well as a lot of the other environmental organizations that are represented here. So,
Yeah, thank you for a little ray, but I also get concerned because if the baseline that we're comparing to is a horrific season, it gets a little tough. And I know just last week, another 50,000 gallons were dumped off of Seminole. So yeah, it just feels really defeating, and Joe, I love what you said about creating that link of how can we inspire our community to fall in love with it, to where, because we feel that when we see this happening, it's like, what? Like, how is this happening? But to other people, it's just, oh, this is what happens when, we have an incident at our plant. But yeah, I definitely feel hungry for some solutions there where that's just, it doesn't happen. Like that is not acceptable. So,
Well, one of the things we're doing here in Barichara that I think is, I'm sure some of this happens in the Tampa Bay, which is children going out into nature and building their nature connection, and then altering the consciousness of their parents. I'm sure this is happening there. I'm sure it is. And it can always happen more than it is, because eco-literacy is a huge issue. That book, Last Child in the Woods, like from the 90s, where basically the parents were freaking out in the US that wouldn't let their kids go outside. And that's why all these eco-illiterate kids are now adults, as their parents were freaking out. That we have to undo that. And so there's a lot of work to do there. Sharon has her hand up.
Actually, Joe, I'm going to hop in,
Yeah,
Sharon,
come in
and
at the
close off with you if we can. But there's two related questions in the chat, one from Taylor and one from JMIC, that I think to summarize are, yeah, this all sounds good, but how do we get our politicians on board and actually do some of the stuff? And I know Joe and I've talked about that tension with you as well. So there's a question of what success have you seen in creating general population movements that demand this kind of long-term investment and commitment, just to take one part of the question.
I would answer by saying that this is grassroots organizing in its deep sense. That if it doesn't come from the people of the territory, you're not going to get the elected officials that align with what those people would want, which means it's a long game, not a short game. But that said, there are some really easy early wins if you can do the right kind of mapping work, which is, I think, what Kerry was showing us, which I think you could do lots of maps with that data. And this relates to Tara's question. If you have good maps, if you have good storytelling, visual storytelling, it can shift things more. It's not the only thing, but it's a thing. And one of the key parts of this is to have people coherently talking about their love of place. And that really does lead to more basically self-organizing. People find themselves drawn in affinity. And just as an example, in Cascadia, the bioregional movement in Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest, one of the most powerful pathways they took was that there's a big rivalry in women's soccer between Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. So someone created the Cascadia flag, and everyone would just wave it at the games, at these women's soccer games. And by the way, the women's soccer there is world class. Actually, won the Women's World Cup a few times. And so these are really serious sports fans. But the fact that sports fans brought their bioregional flag and then their sports teams' logos, they were celebrating their cultural identity. And this changes who gets elected to city council and to these kinds of things. So I think there are lots of ways in. That's just an example that's maybe a bit anecdotal, but it really does come from the people. So it's the ability for people to organize themselves around a shared identity that makes these kinds of things possible. And there are a lot of things you can do with data mapping and visualization to help that as well. That's the 1 minute answer to like a multi-hour conversation.
Right. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, Sharon Joy, if you'd like to.
Hey, thank you everyone for making this possible. Each of us bringing our gifts and resources. This was just terrific, Joe. And I feel like you gave us a watershed going back to the history and the whole bit. Loved it, loved it. Back to solutions. I really appreciate what you said about taking care of who and what you love. And I wanted to point out that we have here in Tampa Bay with the Tampa Bay Times, a leader in creating an eco hub. Maybe some of you know, with the 5 newspapers. And one of their key writers, Max Chesness, has actually talked also. We've been in touch about taking care of who and what you love. So that's 2 things. The other, I think, is a bigger picture, Joe. How do you recommend we get our arms, heads, and hearts around whole system thinking? Are there courses that you're familiar with, like some of us have taken with the Fritjof Capra course, which to me is 12 lessons in a package that you go from, like you said, billions of years ago to say, oh my gosh, you mean we're stardust? And then how do we go into our bioregions? And some of us in these networks are fortunately here to hear you today. So what recommendations, because that's my frustrations. People use this language, it's trendy. They have no clue what they're saying or how to actually be strategic with it, which is where it's more important.
Oh, Sharon, you just open up a great big can of worms.
Opportunities.
I would start with, there are a lot of places like The Capital Institute offers lots of stuff on regenerative economics and regenerative finance. Gaia Education has many offerings, many like eco-village design, regenerative design, etc. There's a bunch of stuff. The Copra course is fantastic. And that whole community, Jeremy Lent's community on eco-civilization, anything you could pick up and read on Dana Meadows. I mean, you could just, there's basically an entire mountain of stuff.
Good.
But what I actually think is most important is to experience it with your own body. And one of the things that we've been discovering in bioregional organizing is how often the bioregional organizing has already been happening. Kerry, again, you're just a perfect embodiment of this, of people in a bioregion, usually women or women-led, who are organizing around direct experience with their waterways. Women who walk their rivers or paddle their lakes or whatever it is, and cultivate a sense of the sacred. There are water walkers. So like an example in Ontario is the Grand River Watershed Water Walkers, who organize water walks around all of the Great Lakes. But these kinds of things, the people who just like, I have a friend, Roberta Hill in Norway, Maine, who does lots of work with teenagers on paddling out into Maine's beautiful lakes and doing citizen science projects for ecosystem restoration in the lakes. That it's amazing how often it's led by women. I'm not saying that men don't do it. It's just amazing how often it's led by women and how often it's been happening for decades, and yet we don't see the power of it. And so this whole systems understanding, a great way to have a whole systems understanding is to have women share their experiences of how water moves through their own bodies. They can talk about the water breaking when they got pregnant or their menstrual cycle or all these things we don't normally talk about, and how that's connected to their connection with rivers and lakes and estuaries. And then how they're already doing this in their landscapes. It's like, it's this hidden world of incredible organizing that's been going on for a long time. So I think a big way to get into whole systems thinking is to experience local waterways with women who feel a sacred connection to their water. And it's just like astonishing how often these women are doing this work completely invisible. Like there's a woman in Toronto who was trying to daylight a river, which is where a river has been completely covered by concrete in downtown Toronto. She was walking this river, meditating on how she wanted the river to come back for like 35 years. And then someone in her community told her, yeah, because people just walk this waterway with her. Someone came to her and said, oh, the city of Toronto has decided to daylight this river. What? Like they're going to go and dig up the concrete and bring sunlight back into the river. And it's because of the social consciousness of women walking in their neighborhoods to walk the path of the river that was under the concrete. This is going on for decades. So it's this kind of work that really brings a whole systems understanding. And so I would just invite you, wherever you are, to find the women who are doing this. Like go with Kerry sometime and measure those fish. She said it jokingly, but go with her and do it. And you'll get a whole systems understanding. So
I'm right on the area where they're doing some of that restoration right now in Tampa Bay.
Yeah. So just, a big shout out to the unsung heroes who are the women who organize with water in the local landscapes.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Well, I know, and Tara, who spoke earlier, she's involved. She'll probably know who I'm talking about. But I met a man who was involved with HCC's Plant City campus, and he told me the story of spending his whole life's work to get water flowing through a creek that had been dry there, and walked me over and showed me the water flowing through it. So there's some of that's happening in this region as well. So with that, this has been absolutely incredible. Turn it over to Kara if you want to hop on and maybe give an overview of the summit that's coming up and any other news from the Regional Planning Council before we sign off here.
Sure. Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, we have our fifth Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Summit in Palmetto, Florida, Manatee County this year on May 15th and 16th. So join us if you can. And then thank you again to Maria and Caleb for all the work that you did on organizing this meeting. This was really helpful, and I think there's some good opportunities to work with TBEP and to work on advancing those habitat conservation goals. And we also have a coastal master plan, like Kerry mentioned. That meeting is coming up May 30th. And so if you are interested, please feel free to take a look at our website. We have lots of opportunities to get involved in that coastal master plan as well.
Awesome. In the 1 minute we have left to be on time, are there any other announcements that'd be good for the order? Well, thank you all. This has been warming to my heart. I really appreciate this discussion. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Joe, for bringing your energy.
Thank you for having us. Lovely to see you all today.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Joe, Caleb, organizers, question, would we be able to share our contact information post-meeting to connect?
Yeah. If you haven't yet, I mean, I have yours, but if you put into the chat, we'll make sure that you get the copy of the presentation and the presentations and the recording. And then if you want to join the group to attend, which I strongly encourage for the future, you can sign up for that as well.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone. Have a beautiful rest of your day.
Bye.
Joe, that was really great. Thank you so much. Everyone have a
You're
great day.
welcome.
Bye,
Thank you all for the great work you're doing.
Good. Come see us, Joe.
Ooh, I'd love to. Maria, thank you. All right, take care. Bye, everyone.
You guys want to stay on and chat?
Yeah,
Sure.
I can stay on for about 5 minutes and then I really need to get back to my classroom. But
Got it. I'm gonna
Maybe
hit
remove those,
stop.
the AI and the